Good afternoon and welcome to this learning video. Microsoft Excel macros. That's what this training video is going to discuss today. Thank you for joining me. I'm Tom. And when we do a lot of tasks repetitively, whether it's in Word or PowerPoint or Excel or Project or Visio or Publisher, Access, etc., we want those tasks to be done as quickly and efficiently as possible. Well, why not let the computer do it instead of us? So, in order to have that happen, in Excel we're going to create a macro. But before we run the macro, we have to record it. And recording macros takes a special skill. I'm going to keep this real simple today. I'm going to show you a handful of things to get you started to create any kind of macro that you want in Excel. Now, the question comes up, what can I put into a macro? And simply the answer is anything that we can do in Excel can be placed into a macro, without exception. Now, there are three ways that we can start recording a macro. The method that I recommend is using the Developer tab. Another method is clicking on this button down here on the status bar that will say, click here to begin recording. And then I would click that button again to stop the recording. The other way of recording a macro is go to the View tab and then click Macros, Record Macro. Well, like I said earlier, I like the Developer tab option where it has the Record Macro button right here. Now I know what some of you may be thinking. I don't see any Developer tab. How can I do that? Well, we'll have to make sure the tab gets added. To do that, we right-click on any tab here and choose Customize the Ribbon. Excel Options window pops up. Here's all the categories. Customize the Ribbon category. We would then have to go over here and make sure there is a checkbox checked next to the word Developer. And then you would have to click OK. That is what makes the Developer tab appear. And then when you exit out of Excel and come back in, it still will be there. All right, so what do we want the macro to do? Well, it's going to be a handful of things. Number one, I want to split the name in column A into two columns. You'll notice that first and last name is in a single column. I want them to be in two. And then balance due, I want to format those numbers that are greater than 0 so that they stand out on the screen. I will format them. Now, the next thing I would do is modify the layout of the columns. In other words, do some formatting, color, border, font size, etc. And then when I'm done recording the macro, I now would like to add a button somewhere on the screen that will allow me to easily run the macro. Now, I could run the macro by using the macros button here, but I like to have a button right on the screen. Makes it a lot easier. All right, so I will also talk about something called relative references, and I'll have another example about that in this learning video as well. So you're kind of getting a twofer, just because I'm nice. Okay, so here we go. Let's get started. The first thing I need to do is click on the Record Macro button. When I do, Excel expects me to give the macro a name, which I need to do. It's just kind of like naming a file. Now I'm going to deliberately make a mistake and begin this macro with a number. I'm going to put a space in there. And then I'm just going to type in some text, whatever I want to call it. Now, when I click OK, I'm going to get a warning. It says that it has to start with either a letter or an underscore character and cannot have spaces. So I'm going to call this customer. Now, underscore makes it look like a space, but it really isn't. Data underscore update. It's highly recommended that we put a description in. Let's say something like split the name column into two. Use conditional formatting to show balance due greater than 0. Click OK. I am now recording the macro. When I'm done, I have to click the button that now says stop recording. Now, I also want to use something called use relative references, which is what I'm going to explain towards the end of this video. It says use relative references so that macros are recorded with actions relative to the initial selected cell. If you look behind that explanation, I am sitting on cell address A1 at the very beginning. And it says, for instance, if I record a macro in cell A1, which moves the cursor to cell address A3, and this option is turned on, running the resulting macro in cell J6 would move the cursor to cell address J8. However, if the option was turned off when the macro was being recorded, running that macro in cell J6 would move the cursor to A3. And this comes into play very often when you have steps in your macro that references formulas and functions with different cell addresses. All right, so let's get started. I want to insert a blank column so that I have room for first name and last name. Right click, insert. While I'm at it, let's change the label here. First name, and then over here, last name. And then what I want to do is I also want to format. Now I know in my earlier explanation I said to write down the steps of how you want to do them in order, and that is imperative. So I would like to take care of this first, even though that's not what I said to do next. So what am I saying? Don't practice what I preach. Okay, so let's say I want to change the fill color. Maybe I want to increase the font size from 11 to 14. And then maybe I want to italicize it. And then I'm going to put a thick bottom border. And there we go. I did some formatting for my column headers. Next thing I want to do is I want to split this one column into two columns. I highlight the names. I go to my data tab, click on text to columns. It says convert text to columns wizard, step 1 of 3. It is delimited text. In other words, the characters are being separated of what I want to test, in this case with a space. Jack, space, Smith, and so forth. I click next to go to step 2, and I have to tell Excel that it is the space character. There's no comma. I don't check comma. It's not a semicolon. If I had an other character, I'd have to click on the other box here, and then click in this box next to it and actually type in whatever that character was, like a dash, an underscore, whatever. But here in this instance, it's space. I click next to go to step 3. You can even see now here it's split into two columns. I click finish. I am a happy camper. Next, I want to highlight the numbers in the balance due. Go to home, conditional formatting, highlight cells rules greater than 0. But maybe I don't like red. Maybe I want it to be green. So I choose green. If you want it to be formatted completely differently, stay tuned for a different video where I get into the custom format options. But that's beyond the scope of this video. I click OK. I'm a happy camper. Anything that has a balance due greater than 0 is highlighted in green. In fact, if I would change one of the numbers right now, let's say from 98 down to 0, it no longer will have the appearance of green when I press 0. And there we go. Now don't forget, I'm still recording the macro. So Maybe you didn't want to do that. I just did it here in the learning video to show you the feature called conditional formatting. So that was an extra step. Be careful is what I'm getting at. Now, I want to stop recording. I click the stop recording button. I now want to add a button that will play that macro that I just recorded by just a single click. I recommend not putting the button where the data could be, so I'm going to put it off to the side. I go to my developer tab and there's this insert button, form controls, first button is called button. I click it and I draw a button on my screen. What comes up is the assign macro dialog box. Now I only have one macro, but there could be 17 macros in here. I would have to select the proper macro to associate that button. And when you click on it, you see what the description is. That's why it's always good to put descriptions in when defining your macros. I click OK. I don't like the text. I want my own text. I right click, edit text, and then I put in what I really wanted to say, update customer info. Now, I click off of that button. You'll see what happens when I bring my mouse onto the button. It changes shape. But I don't want to play the macro again. It's already working on this sheet. So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to get everything back to the way it was. Okay, now I am ready to play this macro. I want to play the macro, or run the macro, same thing, by clicking on this button. Here we go. Look at that. Beautiful, it worked. And it even remembered my cell going there to C7 where I changed Laura's balance due from 95 or 98, whatever that value was, to 0. So it remembered exactly where I ended recording the macro. You can see the format. It worked. It split it into 2 columns. I'm a happy camper. Now, I want to edit this macro because let's say one of the things I want to do is I want to modify the point size on row 1 with the column headers. Now, it's not the greatest thing to change, but the purpose of me bringing this up is I want you all to see what it looks like when you edit a macro. Take a hold of your seats. It's going to be overwhelming, especially for us non-programmer type individuals. And by the way, in an earlier life, I was a COBOL programmer. Been there, done that. Okay, so how do I edit a macro? Well, there's a couple ways of doing it. You know me, I like the developer tab. So I go to the developer tab, and over here, to bring up what's called the Visual Basic window, I click the button called Visual Basic. Ooh, there it is. It's right on top of the spreadsheet. Now, I'm going to double click on Module 2 here. By the way, I had a Module 1 when I was practicing around earlier before this video. And when I double clicked, the whole macro came up. Now at the top, there's green text with the little divot lines to the left of it. Excel will ignore anything up here in green with these little divot marks. And if you recall, it's actually what I typed in my description. Okay, so as I mentioned, I want to change the font size from 14 to 16. So I highlight the 14 and I change it to 16 by typing in 16. I have to click save, just like a regular saving of a document. Well, let me put it this way. We should click the save button. Now, what I also want to do is, instead of first name, last name, I want to abbreviate first with just the letter F. Get rid of the extra space. And do the same thing with last name. Change it to just L. Get rid of the extra space. Click Save. You also can use the Control F Find feature to find certain text or values in your macro. This macro is not very big, but what if it was? You don't want to waste time eyeballing it, one line at a time. So then I can use the find feature if I wanted to. Okay, now let's see if it works. I click Save. I now click File and choose Close and Return to Excel. I'm back to my file. We trainers have a little saying, proof is in the pudding. Let's see if it works. What I'm going to do is I'm going to play that macro back again using the button that I added. What should happen is everything should come out the way it did before playing the macro, but the minor change with increasing the font to size 16. So here we go. Click on the button. Look at that. Size 16. I'm a happy camper. So the reason I did that was to show you briefly what it looks like when you need to edit a macro. I'll just go back into the macro again so you can just take a look at it real quickly. Developer tab, Visual Basic, and you may or may not have to double click on the module name to have it show up, depending on whether you looked at it before or not. Look at that. You need to have a programmer's state of mind and way of thinking to understand Visual Basic, which is the programming language that's used to create these macros in Excel. Now, I promise I would also show you what does it mean when we talk about use relative references. I'm going to go to a different sheet in this workbook, and I'm going to type in some names. And after I typed in these names, what I'm going to do is turn on the Use Relative References button. And then I'm going to record a second macro that will highlight these 3 cells and format them with a couple of different formats. And then I'm going to talk about this area down here as well. Okay, so remember we have to record the macro. So I click the Record Macro button. I'm going to call this one Relative Reference Test. I'm going to put a description in. Format cells regarding relative reference. And I click OK. I am recording the macro right now. So, as I said, I just want to do some real simple formats. I highlight the cells first. Let's say I want to turn on bold, change the shading to a different color, and maybe italicize, and put a surrounding outer border. And that's all I wanted to do. Okay, so now I need to stop recording. Notice, though, I did this from E8 to G8. If you remember, we talked about this description about the Use Relative References button. I stop recording. Now, I'm not going to use a button to play the macro back. I want to save a little bit of time, but I could. So when I play the macro back onto this range of cells, which is not in E7, which is not in E8, but rather it's in E16, it will still work because I use the Relative References button. But it will not spill over to column H. It will only do it for the first 3 cells. Here we go. Click on Macros. Single click the macro that I just created called Relative Reference Test and click the Run button. Voila! It worked because I used the Use Relative References button. I could have been anywhere. I did not have to be at E8. And it did not spill over to H because the first time I created the macro, I only highlighted 3 cells, not for. But then I can also cheat a little bit and use the favorite format painter button, and now I'm a happy camper. Now, there's another way to make that look consistent, but that goes beyond the scope of this video. However, I have an excellent video that talks about styles in Excel. All right, thanks for watching. Here's my email address. You know where to find me. I'll answer your questions about Excel, Word, PowerPoint, Outlook, Teams, Access, Project, Publisher, Visio, OneNote, OneDrive. I listed them all. Oh yeah, also about Microsoft Windows. Have a great day, everybody. Thanks for watching.